Chapter 2, Mrs. Who. Still with the poetry stuff. So obviously a new character. We haven't met her yet. We'll probably be meeting her here. But also, again, let's watch the setting and how it changes because we do get a little bit of movement. And actually break this apart into several different sections. Maybe. We'll see. I may just read the whole thing again. I know it's long, but at the end of the day, we'll have it all on video so that we can watch it, download it, so that if you miss anything, you can always go back and read it with me. All right, here we go. And again, working on the voices here. We'll see if I even remember the voices from last time. When Meg woke up to the jangling of her alarm clock, so again, right away, setting. She's waking up. We hear the jangling of the alarm clock, so we know it's probably morning. The wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in bed, shaking her head to clear it. So we right away, morning, in her room, boom, time and place, setting is set. And the storm is over. So again, symbolizing what that storm meant in chapter 1, seemed like it was kind of leading up to Mrs. What's-It. Now the storm is over. What's going to happen next? It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp. So she'd just dreamed about going down to the kitchen and seeing Mrs. What's-It and having her mother get all frightened and upset by the word. What was it? Tess something. She dressed hurriedly, picked up the kitten still curled up on the bed, and dumped it unceremoniously on the floor. The kitten yawned as cats do. You know cats, you just kind of throw them around, they land on their feet, and off they go. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous meow. Sort of onomatopoeia. A great vocabulary, though, piteous. Trotted out of the attic and down the stairs. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast, and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer. "Where's Charles?" Meg asked. "Still asleep. We had a rather interrupted night, if you remember." "I hoped it was a dream," Meg said. "Not a dream." Her mother carefully turned over 4 slices of French toast, then said in a steady voice, "No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do. But one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to have a joke about the Tesseract." "What is a Tesseract?" Meg asked. "It's a concept." Mrs. Murray handed the twins the syrup. "I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school." "I don't see why you didn't wake us up," Dennis said. "It's a jip we missed out on all the fun." "You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will." Meg took her French toast to the table. "Who cares?" Sandy said. "If you're going to let old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night." "Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you." So right away, I think about the twin brothers in Harry Potter series. Remember, they were, I don't know that I call them good athletes, but they were kind of sort of protectory. And of course, they were really good members of the Quidditch team. So a little bit of a connection here. Maybe when that book was written, those twins were written with maybe this book in mind, since they're both sci-fi-ish, both fantasy. So perhaps that plays part. "After all, Father would expect us to," Dennis added. "We know you all have a great mind and all, Mother," Sandy said, "but you don't have much sense, and certainly Meg and Charles don't." "I know, we're morons." Meg was bitter. Do you really think she thinks she's a moron? She sort of said that with sarcasm. So remember, good lit term that we aren't going to be doing this year, but sarcasm. So they said it. She didn't say that as though she thought she was a moron, even though we know that she's hard on herself. She was sort of basically kind of give it, if you got brothers and sisters, you know exactly what I'm talking about. "I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg. Syrup, please." Sandy reached across the table. "You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You just goof around in school and look out the window and don't pay any attention." You just make things harder for yourself, Dennis said, and Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people, and they're so used to thinking he's dumb. I don't know what's going to happen to him. Sandy and I will sock anybody who picks on him, but that's about all we can do. Let's not worry about next year till we get through this one, Mrs. Marie said. More French toast, boys? And here in the story, we get this little break. So obviously we're going to time jump. At school, Meg was tired and her eyelids sagged and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked to name the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua. And though she had looked at them dutifully the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic, there's the word. The rest of the class laughed, and she flung herself down in her seat in a fury. Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua anyhow, she muttered. If you're going to be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room, the teacher said. Okay, I will. Meg flounced out. Good vocabulary word. During study hall, the principal sent for her. What seems to be the problem now, Meg? He asked pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkily down at the floor. Nothing, Mr. Jenkins. New character. Good word there, too, sulkily. Mrs. Porter tells me you were inexcusably rude. Meg shrugged. Don't you realize that you just make everything harder for yourself by your attitude? The principal asked. Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you can do the work and keep up with your grade if you will apply yourself, but some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you. Meg was silent. Well, what about it, Meg? I don't know what to do, Meg said. Well, you could do your homework for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you? If I asked her to. Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home? Mr. Jenkins asked. Okay, so right away, Mr. Jenkins does seem to treat her differently than other people do. He seems sort of nice, like he's trying to help her out. Let's see if that continues. And Meg's sort of receptive to it. At last, Meg looked at him, pushed at her glasses in a characteristic gesture. Everything's fine at home. I'm glad to hear it, but I know it must be hard on you to have your father away. Where is her father? Meg eyed the principal warily and ran her tongue over the barbed line of her braces. Have you had any news from him lately? Meg was sure it was not only imagination that made her feel that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know, she thought. And if I knew anything, he's the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last. The postmistress must know that it was almost a year now since the last letter. Okay, so this is a really cool little thing that's happening in the book. So he asked her a question. Now in the story, Madeline Langle's going back a little bit and sort of maybe walking us through a little bit of what happened to Dad while fitting it within the story. It's not quite an anecdote, a story within the story, but it feels like the touch of one. Let's see if it continues. The postmistress must know that it was almost a year now since the last letter, and heaven knows how many people she'd told, or what unkind guesses she'd made about the reason for the long silence. Mr. Jenkins waited for an answer, but Meg only shrugged. Just what was your father's line of business? Mr. Jenkins asked. Some kind of scientist, wasn't he? He's a physicist. Meg bared her teeth to reveal the two ferocious lines of braces. Meg, don't you think you'd make a better adjustment to life if you faced facts? I do face facts, Meg said. They're a lot easier to face than people, I can tell you. Then why don't you face facts about your father? You leave my father out of it, Meg shouted. Stop bellowing, Mr. Jenkins said sharply. Do you want the entire school to hear you? So what? Meg demanded. I'm not ashamed of anything I'm saying. Are you? Mr. Jenkins sighed. Do you enjoy being the most belligerent, vocabulary, uncooperative child in school? Meg ignored this. She leaned over the desk toward the principal. Mr. Jenkins, you've met my mother, haven't you? You can't accuse her of not facing facts, can you? She's a scientist. She has a doctor's degrees in both biology and bacteriology. Her business is facts. When she tells me that my father isn't coming home, I'll believe it. As long as she says father is coming home, then I'll believe that. Ooh. So, hold on. Let's finish this, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Mr. Jenkins said to her. Mr. Jenkins sighed again. No doubt your mother wants to believe your father is coming home, Meg. Very well. I can't do anything else with you. Go on back to study hall. Try to be a little less antagonistic, vocabulary word. Maybe your work would improve if your general attitude were more tractable, vocabulary word. All right. So again, we have another one of those gaps. Let's just talk a little bit about that one line that Mr. Jenkins said to her twice. Then why don't you face facts about your father? What facts is he saying? What's he saying to her? Sounds like he's saying he just wants her to admit father's not coming home. He's either just gone or he's dead. Meg said, I'll listen to my mom before I'm going to listen to you. And honestly, pretty sensible. When Meg got home from school, so we've now jumped a little bit more in time, her mother was in the lab, the twins were at Little League, and Charles Wallace, the kitten, and Fortinbras were waiting for her. Fortinbras jumped up, put his front paws on her shoulder, and gave her a kiss. Then the kitten rushed to his empty saucer and meowed loudly. Come on, Charles Wallace said. Let's go. Where? Meg asked. I'm hungry, Charles. I don't want to go anywhere till I've had something to eat. She was still sore from the interview with Mr. Jenkins, and her voice sounded cross. Charles Wallace looked at her thoughtfully as she went to the refrigerator and gave the kitten some milk, then drank a mugful herself. He handed her a paper bag, because of course he's going to know. Here's a sandwich and some cookies and an apple. I thought we'd better go see Mrs. Whatsit. Oh, golly, Meg said. Why, Charles? You're still uneasy about her, aren't you? Charles asked. Well, yes. Don't be. She's all right. I promise you. She's on our side. Well, how do you know? Meg, he said impatiently. I know. But why should we go see her now? Well, I want to find out more about that Tesseract thing. Didn't you see how it upset Mother? You know, when Mother can't control the way she feels, when she lets us see she's upset, then it's something big. So look how smart Charles Wallace is. I mean, they keep talking about themselves like they're morons, but it's clear that Meg and Charles Wallace are really smart. Charles Wallace is very strange. And I'm not saying that in a mean way. I'm saying that Madeline L'Engle has given him almost an adult personality. There's been nothing about him that's kid-like other than the fact that he's 5 and that he hasn't gone to school yet. But he's sort of driving everything here. Very interesting. And everybody respects him in the family and Mrs. Whatsit. So he's very much like an adult here. And he's got this like sensory thing where he sort of reads people really well that he really cares about. So you can see that he knew that she was going to be hungry, had the sandwich ready and is all ready to go, knows about mom, had the cocoa ready in chapter 1. So here's this really neat little characteristic about Charles Wallace that lets us know, A, he's a main character, and B, obviously this is going to play into what's going to happen in the future. And I have to say, you're probably already right now thinking with all of this space left in the book of what this book is really kind of gleaning to. Well, the father's missing. So right away, we need that question answered. Is that what this story is about? Them trying to get the father? Or is there something else? What's this Tesseract? Are they going to try to find that? It's hard to say because we don't know what a Tesseract is. Hopefully we'll find out in chapter 2. Meg thought for a moment. Okay, let's go. But let's take Fortinbras with us. Well, of course. He needs the exercise. They set off. Okay, so now we're changing setting again. Fortinbras rushing ahead, then doubling back to the two children, then leaping off again. The Murrays lived about 4 miles out of the village. Behind the house was a pine woods, and it was through this that Charles Wallace took Meg. So after school, now walking through this pine forest behind her house. Charles, you know she's going to get in awful trouble. Mrs. Whatsit, I mean, if they find out she's broken into the haunted house and taking Mrs. Buncombe's sheets and everything, they could send her to jail. One of the reasons I want to go over this afternoon is to warn them. Them? I told you she was there with 2 friends. I'm not even sure it was Mrs. Whatsit herself who took the sheets, though I wouldn't put it past her. But what would she want all those sheets for? I intend to ask her, Charles Wallace said, and to tell them they'd better be more careful. I don't really think they'll let anybody find them, but I just thought we ought to mention the possibility. Sometimes during vacations, some of the boys go out there looking for thrills, but I don't think anybody's apt to right now. What with basketball and everything. They walked in silence for a moment through the fragrant woods. Imagery. Let's see how many we can get here. They walked in silence for a moment through the fragrant woods, the rusty pine needles gentle under their feet. Up above them, the wind made music in the branches. Charles Wallace slipped his hand confidently in Meg's, and the sweet little boy gesture warmed her so that she felt the tense knot inside her begin to loosen. Does she have a knot really inside of her? No, a nice metaphor there. So she's all... And now Charles, acting like a little boy now, grabbing her hand like a little boy would, is sort of melting that knot. Charles loves me at any rate, she thought. School awful again today? He asked after a while. Yes, I got sent to Mr. Jenkins. He made a snide remark about father. Charles Wallace nodded sagely. Snide? Smart alecky. Sagely. Smart. I know. How do you know? Charles Wallace shook his head. I can't quite explain. You tell me, that's all. But I never said anything. You just seem to know. Everything about you tells me, Charles said. How about the twins, Meg asked. Do you know about them too? I suppose I could if I wanted to, if they needed me, but it's sort of tiring, so I just concentrate on you and Mother. So it is sort of like a magic power? And let's take note of that. When he does concentrate on them, it does make him tired. So this isn't something that he can just do. You mean you read our minds? Charles Wallace looked troubled. I don't think it's that. It's being able to understand a sort of language. Like sometimes if I concentrate very hard, I can understand the wind talking with the trees. You tell me. You see, sort of inadvertently. That's a good word, isn't it? I got Mother to look it up in the dictionary for me this morning. I really must learn to read, except I'm afraid it will make it awfully hard for me in school next year if I already know things, which he clearly already knows. But here's another. He doesn't know how to read. So there, that does let us know he's a 5-year-old. And he's thinking ahead. He already knows he's going to be in trouble when he goes to school. So he's like, maybe if I don't read, they won't think I'm strange. So he's very smart. Ahead of them, Fortinbras started barking loudly. And we know whenever he barks, something's going on. The warning bay that usually told them that a car was coming up the road or that someone was at the door. Chapter 1. Somebody's here, Charles Wallace said sharply. Somebody's hanging around the house. Come on. So now they're at the haunted house. They're right there. He started to run, his short legs straining. At the edge of the woods, Fortinbras stood in front of the boy, barking furiously. As they came panting up, the boy said, For crying out loud, call off your dog. Who is he? Charles Wallace asked Meg. Calvin O'Keefe. He's in regional, but he's older than I am. He's a big bug. It's all right, fella. I'm not going to hurt you, the boy said to Fortinbras. Sit, Fort, Charles Wallace commanded, and Fortinbras dropped to his haunches in front of the boy, a low growl still pulsing in his dark throat. New character, Calvin O'Keefe. Okay, Charles Wallace put his hands on his hips. Now, tell us what you're doing here. Well, I might ask the same of you, the boy said with some indignation. Good vocabulary word. Like a little bit of force there. We'll look that up. Aren't you two of the Murray kids? This isn't your property, is it? He started to move, but Fortinbras's growl grew louder and he stopped. Tell me about him, Meg, Charles Wallace demanded. So it's kind of funny. Charles Wallace is talking about him to Meg, and he's standing right there. So he's not saying, tell me about yourself. He's asking Meg to. What would I know about him, Meg asked. He's a couple of grades above me, and he's on the basketball team. Just because I'm tall, Calvin sounded a little embarrassed. Tall he certainly was, and skinny. His bony wrists stuck out of the sleeves of his blue sweater. His worn corduroy trousers were 3 inches too short. He had orange hair that needed cutting and the appropriate freckles to go along with it. His eyes were an oddly bright blue. So it's interesting. So we know he's a basketball player, but automatically our author, Madeline L'Engle, is immediately telling us that he's not typical. Like he's gangly and he's got red kind of disheveled hair and his eyes are this super bright blue. Tell us what you're doing here, Charles Wallace said. What is this, the third degree? Aren't you the one who's supposed to be the moron? Meg flushed with rage, but Charles Wallace answered placidly, good vocab word. That's right. If you want to call my dog off, you'd better give. Most peculiar moron I've ever met, Calvin said. I just came to get away from my family. Charles Wallace nodded. What kind of family? They all have runny noses. I'm third from the top of 11 kids. I'm a sport. At that, Charles Wallace grinned widely. So am I. I don't mean like in baseball, Calvin said. Neither do I. I mean like in biology, Calvin said suspiciously. A change in gene, Charles Wallace quoted, resulting in the appearance in the offspring of a character which is not present in the parents, but which is potentially transmissible to the offspring. So sport means something genetic. It's a different from the parents. That's kind of random. What gives around here? Calvin asked. I was told you couldn't talk. Thinking I'm a moron gives people something to feel smug about, Charles Wallace said. Why should I disillusion them? How old are you, Cal? 14. What grade? Junior, 11th. I'm bright. Listen, did anyone ask you to come here this afternoon? Charles Wallace, holding Fort by the collar, looked at Calvin suspiciously. What do you mean, asked? Calvin shrugged. You still don't trust me, do you? I don't distrust you, Charles Wallace said. Do you want to tell me why you're here then? Fort and Mag and I decided to go for a walk. We often do in the afternoon. Calvin dug his hands down in his pockets. You're holding out on me. So are you, Charles Wallace said. Okay, old sport, Calvin said. I'll tell you this much. Sometimes I get a feeling about things. You might call it a compulsion. Do you know what a compulsion means? Constraint, obligation, because one is compelled. Not a very good definition, but it's concise Oxford. Okay, Calvin sighed. I must remember, I'm preconditioned in my concept of your mentality. He's preconditioned. He already thinks that he's a moron, but we know that Charles Wallace isn't. So Charles Wallace knew what compulsion meant. So think about this. Calvin felt kind of this feeling to go to this house the same way that sort of Charles Wallace felt. So there's a connection there. Very interesting. Meg sat down on the coarse grass at the edge of the woods. Fort gently twisted his collar out of Charles Wallace's hands and came over to Meg, lying down beside her and putting his head in her lap. Calvin tried now politely to direct his words toward Meg as well as Charles Wallace. When I get this feeling, this compulsion, I always do what it tells me. I can't explain where it comes from or how I get it, and it doesn't happen very often, but I obey. And this afternoon, I had a feeling that I must come over to the haunted house. That's all I know, kid. I'm not holding anything back. Maybe it's because I'm supposed to meet you. You tell me. So this sort of feels the same as Charles Wallace. Let's see. Charles Wallace looked at Calvin probingly for a moment. Then an almost glazed look came into his eyes, and he seemed to be thinking at him. Calvin stood very still and waited. I wonder if this is what Charles Wallace does when he's trying to kind of predict what's going on. Remember, he said he has to think about it really hard. At last, Charles Wallace said, "Okay, I believe you, but I can't tell you. I think I'd like to trust you. Maybe you'd better come home with us and have dinner." "Well, sure, but what would your mother say to that?" Calvin asked. "Oh, she'd be delighted. Mother's all right. She's not one of us, but she's all right." "What about Meg?" "Meg has it tough," Charles Wallace said. "She's not really one thing or the other." "What do you mean, one of us?" Meg demanded. "What do you mean I'm not one thing or the other?" "Not now, Meg," Charles Wallace said. "Slowly, I'll tell you about it later." He looked at Calvin, then seemed to make a quick decision. "Okay, let's take him to meet Mrs. Whatsit. If he's not okay, she'll know." He started off on his short legs toward the dilapidated old house. Dilapidated. Old house, we know it's a haunted house. So tomorrow, what's dilapidated mean? The haunted house was half in the shadows of the clump of elms in which it stood. The elms were almost bare now, and the ground around the house was yellow with damp leaves. The late afternoon light had a greenish cast, which the blank windows reflected in a sinister way. An unhinged shutter thumped. Something else creaked. Meg did not wonder that the house had a reputation for being haunted. So we saw a lot there. We heard a lot there. Beautiful imagery, and it continues. So imagery. A board was nailed across the front door, but Charles Wallace led the way around to the back. The door there appeared to be nailed shut too, but Charles Wallace knocked, and the door swung slowly outward, creaking on rusty hinges. Up in one of the elms, an old black crow gave a raucous cry, and a woodpecker went into a wild rat-a-tat-tat onomatopoeia. A large gray rat scuttled around the corner of the house, and Meg let out a stifled shriek. They get a lot of fun out of using all the typical props," Charles Wallace said in a reassuring voice. "Come on, follow me." What does that mean? Haunted house. So see if you guys can predict what that means. Calvin put a strong hand to Meg's elbow, and Ford pressed against her leg. Happiness at their concern was so strong in her that her panic fled, and she followed Charles Wallace into the dark recesses of the house without fear. So they're describing her as happy. And remember, through this whole story up to now, we're on page, in my book, 40. She's not been happy, but she's feeling happy going into this haunted house with these people that she's only met once, and they're very strange people. More imagery. They entered into a sort of kitchen. There was a huge fireplace with a big black pot hanging over a merry fire. Why had there been no smoke visible from the chimney? Something in the pot was bubbling, and it smelled more like one of Mrs. Murray's chemical messes than something to eat. In a dilapidated Boston rocker, there's that word again, sat a plump little woman. She wasn't Mrs. Whatsit, so she must, Meg decided, be one of Mrs. Whatsit's two friends. She wore enormous spectacles, twice as thick and twice as large as Meg's, and she was sewing busily, with rapid jabbing stitches on a sheet. Several other sheets lay on the dusty floor. There are those sheets. Charles Wallace went up to her. "I really don't think you ought to have taken Mrs. Buncombe's sheets without consulting me," he said, as cross and bossy as only a very small boy can be. "What on earth do you want them for?" The plump little woman beamed at him. "Oh, why Charlesy, my pet?" Okay, so right now we're going to be getting into some French and German and a bunch of, I cannot say any of these things. So just know that My class, if you're listening to this, is just normal for me. If you're somebody else listening to this, just, I'll have to read this like 10 times to get it even close to right. This is the second time today I've read it, but I can't read it. So I'm going to do the best I can. Le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point. French. Pascal. The heart has its reasons, whereof reasons know nothing. So what Mrs. Who does is she says something in a different language and then says it in English. So just bear with me. My kids will laugh at me tomorrow, but such is life. But that's not appropriate at all, Charles said. Let me do that again just so we can kind of... The plump little woman beamed at him. Well, Charlesy, my pet, le quoi a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point. French. Pascal. The heart has its reasons, whereof reasons know nothing. But that's not appropriate at all, Charles said crossly. Oh, your mother would find it so. A smile seemed to gleam through the roundness of spectacles. I'm not talking about my mother's feelings about my father, Charles Wallace scolded. I'm talking about Mrs. Buncombe's sheets. He's really bothered about these sheets. The little woman sighed. The enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. In case we need ghosts, of course, she said. I should think you'd have guessed. If we have to frighten anyone away, What's-It thought we ought to do it appropriately. That's why it's so much fun to stay in a haunted house. But we really didn't mean you to know about the sheets. Auf frischer Tat ertappt, German. In flagrante delicto, Latin. Caught in the act. English, as I was saying. But Charles Wallace held up his hand in a peremptory gesture. Mrs. Who, do you know this boy? Calvin bowed. Good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't quite catch your name. Mrs. Who will do, the woman said. He wasn't my idea, Charlesy, but I think he's a good one. Where's Mrs. What's-It? Charles asked. Oh, she's busy. It's getting near time, Charlesy. Getting near time. Ab honesto virum bonum nihil deterrect, Seneca. Nothing deters a good man from doing what is honorable. And he's a very good man, Charlesy, darling, but right now he needs our help. Who? Meg demanded. Little Megsy, lovely to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now go home, loves. The time is not yet ripe. Don't worry, we won't go without you. Get plenty of food and rest. Feed Calvin up. Now off with you. Justice sorrow fides. Latin again. Of course, faith is the sister of justice. Trust in us now, shoo. And she fluttered up from her chair and pushed them out the door with surprising power. Charles, Meg said, I don't understand. Charles took her by the hand and dragged her away from the house. Fortinbras ran on ahead, and Calvin was close behind them. No, he said, I don't either, yet. Not quite. I'll tell you what I know as soon as I can, but you saw Fort, didn't you? Not a growl, not a quiver, just as though there weren't anything strange about it. So you know it's okay. Look, do me a favor, both of you. Let's not talk about it till we've had something to eat. I need fuel so I can sort things out and assimilate them properly. Lead on, moron, Calvin cried gaily. I've never seen your house, and I have the funniest feeling that for the first time in my life, I'm going home. That was a weird thing to say. So we meet a brand new character, two brand new characters. We've got Calvin, who seems to fit right in and is coming home and seems to think that this is home. And we know that, well, he plays basketball. We know he's quirky. He's got this kind of intuition like Charles Wallace does, so he fits in there, but we still don't really know how he fits into the bigger story. We do know, however, it seems like Mrs. What's-It and Mrs. Who and whoever this other lady is, we know that they sort of maybe have gotten Calvin involved as well as all them, and they do give it away. It does appear like we're going to maybe hunt for their father. So a pretty big piece of information in chapter 2. So that was your assignment for this weekend. Obviously, for the next couple of days, we're going to read at least one more chapter before our big winter break that's coming up. If you got a little bit ahead, you can see that I always get a little bit ahead. We have our third Mrs. Witch, and I think this one's really a nice play on words, because it's not the way we spell witch, like the Christmas witch, but it does seem like they have witchy qualities. They're living in this haunted house. It's supposedly a haunted house, and they're not really haunting it, but they are haunting it. They're doing some things and putting some things in place, like the sheets. They literally stole sheets so they can walk around looking like ghosts to make people think that it's haunted. So very, very interesting. So coming next, when we sit down and we'll talk, let's look at some of those vocabulary words. We'll talk about the plot. We'll talk about the setting. We'll talk about similes and metaphors, and on to the next, chapter 3. We should finish this book in, I don't know, we'll see. With the break coming up, I'm not sure. But, and one last thing. The character so there in the book is Mrs. Who. Her name is Mindy Kaling. For those of you that maybe watched, I don't know, she's not been in anything. I know she was in a show called The Office. It's Oprah Winfrey. Wonder who she is. On to the next. Good job, guys.